When my cousin Cody and I were in our early 20s, we developed a habit of heading out on camping trips around Colorado. Cody was always the driving force behind these excursions, a natural leader, thanks to his experience as an Eagle Scout. I, on the other hand, just tagged along for the adventure, happy to let him take the reins. This particular trip happened when I was 22 and Cody was 23. We decided to explore Urpo Forest, a new destination for me, but familiar territory for him. He had camped there before and assured me it was a perfect spot to unwind and disconnect. One of the perks of our jobs at the time was the freedom to take off days during the middle of the week. We always took advantage of this, enjoying quieter roads and less crowded campsites. Cody loved the peace and solitude that came with being deep in nature, and I was starting to see the appeal myself. This trip started like most of our others, with Cody mapping out the plan, packing the essentials, and leaving me with the simpler tasks. He always made camping feel effortless, even though I knew there was a lot of preparation behind the scenes. We parked near a small picnic area, unloading our gear and venturing into the woods. The sun was still high, casting a warm glow through the thick canopy of trees. After about 15 minutes of hiking, Cody found what he called the perfect spot. It was a clearing large enough for our 2 tents, a portable stove, and a campfire. Cody's knack for finding idyllic campsites always amazed me. This one was no exception. It felt like we had stumbled upon a hidden gem in the middle of nowhere. Setting up camp was our first task. Cody, as always, pitched his tent in record time. I, however, struggled with mine, fumbling with poles and fabric for over 20 minutes. It was a routine we both laughed about, but in truth, it was a testament to how different our skill levels were. Cody didn't mind my slower pace. He even offered to help, but I stubbornly declined, determined to get it right on my own. By the time I finished, Cody had already started arranging the stones for our campfire. As the day stretched on, we gathered sticks and wood for the fire. Cody had brought along a fire starter and a lighter, making the task much easier than it could have been. Though he playfully called it cheating, I didn't mind. Watching the fire come to life as the sun dipped below the horizon was mesmerizing. The crackling flames painted the surrounding trees in flickering shades of orange and yellow, setting the perfect atmosphere for the evening. Dinner was Cody's domain. He had packed steaks and burgers, along with an array of seasonings and sides. Cooking over an open flame was his specialty, and I trusted him entirely when it came to food. Cody didn't just view meals as sustenance. He saw them as an integral part of the camping experience. The aroma of sizzling meat wafted through the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. It was moments like these that made camping so special, simple, unhurried, and deeply satisfying. We had bear spray on hand, just in case the smell of food attracted any unwanted visitors. Cody assured me that encountering a black bear was highly unlikely, but he also reminded me of something that always stuck with me. The real danger in the woods isn't the wildlife, it's other people. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Cody's words seemed like a general cautionary statement, nothing more. After dinner, we cracked open a couple of beers and put on some classic rock. The music played softly through Cody's portable speaker as we reminisced about old times. If you've never been camping, it's hard to describe the unique vibe of sitting around a campfire with someone you trust, sharing stories and laughter under a blanket of stars. It felt like the world outside the forest didn't exist, and for a while, that was a comforting thought. As night fully enveloped the forest, we decided to play cards. Cody had brought a small folding table specifically for this purpose. We started with traditional card games before moving on to Uno, a game that always brought out our competitive sides. It was during a particularly intense round of Uno that we heard it, a faint humming sound, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. Both of us froze, our ears straining to catch more. I instinctively paused the music on my phone, plunging the campsite into an eerie silence. The humming was unmistakable now, It was coming from somewhere beyond the glow of our campfire, deep in the pitch-black forest. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer before halting altogether. Cody's expression turned serious. "Find the flashlight," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. I fumbled through our supplies, my hands trembling slightly. By the time I found it and switched it on, the sound had stopped completely. I turned to Cody, my voice shaking. "Do you think it's something to worry about?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the dark perimeter of our clearing, his body tense. Finally, he said, "It's unusual, very unusual." His tone was calm, but I could tell he was unsettled. Cody wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and that made his unease even more alarming. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves that it was probably just a hiker passing through. But deep down, neither of us believed that. The atmosphere had shifted. The once comforting silence of the forest now felt oppressive. We continued our game, though the music was turned down to a barely audible level. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves put us on edge. And then it happened. A large stick landed in the center of our campsite with a loud thud, sending a shower of sparks from the fire. Both Cody and I jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding. It wasn't a random branch falling from a tree. The force and trajectory made it clear that someone had thrown it. Cody yelled into the darkness, his voice echoing through the forest. "Whoever's out there, knock it off. Get a life." The only response was the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. The noise grew fainter until it was swallowed by the night. My instincts told me we needed to pack up and leave, but Cody was adamant about staying put. "Moving in the dark is more dangerous," he reasoned. "We have bear spray, and we'll keep it close. Let's just stay alert." Reluctantly, I agreed. But as the night wore on, the unsettling sounds persisted. Branches snapping, faint whispers, and what sounded like movement just beyond the tree line. Cody suggested taking turns keeping watch. He volunteered to go first, promising to stay awake and read while I got some rest. I crawled into my tent, clutching the can of bear spray like a lifeline. Sleep didn't come easily. The events of the evening replayed in my mind, each sound amplifying my paranoia. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless slumber. Waking up in the middle of the night while camping isn't unusual. The cold, the discomfort of a sleeping bag, or even the unfamiliar sounds of the forest can disturb your sleep. At first, I wasn't sure what woke me. My mind was groggy, still clinging to the remnants of sleep as I stared at the dark ceiling of my tent. Then, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps. I sat up, straining to listen. My heart started to race as I noticed the silhouette of a head peering into my tent. "Cody," I called out, my voice thick with sleep. My initial thought was that he was waking me for my turn to keep watch. But something about the figure seemed off. The face was obscured by the darkness, and the way it loomed silently at the edge of the tent sent a wave of unease through me. "Is it my turn?" I asked, more awake now, my pulse quickening. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the zipper of the tent slid upward in one swift motion, and the head disappeared. I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, a cold realization hit me. Cody wouldn't just silently stare at me like that. Something was wrong. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting only a faint glow around the campsite. Cody wasn't there. The clearing was empty, save for the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. Panic gripped me as I crawled out of the tent and hurried to Cody's. I unzipped it and found him sound asleep in his sleeping bag. "Cody," I whispered harshly, shaking him awake. He groaned, clearly disoriented. "Someone's here," I said, my voice trembling. "I saw them at my tent." It took a moment for him to fully wake up and process what I was saying. When he did, his expression shifted to one of alarm. He grabbed the can of bear spray from beside his sleeping bag and stood up. "Stay close," he whispered, stepping out of the tent. I followed, clutching my own can of spray tightly. The forest around us was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. Cody scanned the clearing with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's out there?" he called out, his voice firm. There was no response. The silence felt suffocating, pressing down on us from all sides. "I think we should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't normal." Cody hesitated, then shook his head. "Not in the dark. It's too risky. We'll wait until dawn." He handed me the flashlight and said, "You should sleep in my tent tonight. Safer that way." I didn't argue. But first, I had to retrieve my sleeping bag from my tent. As I hurried across the clearing, the sound of humming stopped me in my tracks. It was the same eerie melody we had heard earlier, drifting from somewhere just beyond the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced back at Cody, who was already looking in the same direction, his face pale. "You hear that too, right?" I whispered. He nodded, gripping his can of bear spray tighter. "Hurry up," he urged. I ducked into my tent, grabbed my sleeping bag, and bolted back to Cody's. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an unsettling void of silence. We climbed into his tent and zipped it shut, each of us clutching our makeshift weapons like lifelines. The proximity of the bear spray was cold comfort, but it was all we had. The hours dragged on. Cody stayed awake for the first watch while I tried to sleep, but my mind refused to quiet. Every noise, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. When Cody finally shook me awake to switch shifts, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Just a couple more hours," he said, lying down and pulling his sleeping bag over his head. I sat in the tent, flashlight in hand, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, just as the first faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I heard it, a faint, deliberate tapping on the side of the tent. Cody gestured for me to stay quiet as he unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. He scanned the clearing with the flashlight, but there was nothing there. No figures, no movement, just the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. "We're packing up and leaving," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no room for argument. We quickly gathered our belongings, not bothering to pack everything neatly. Our only priority was getting out of the forest as quickly. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "Cody," I hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned, clearly annoyed, but when he saw the terror in my eyes, he sat up instantly. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, sending shivers down my spine. Cody gestured for me to stay quiet as he unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. He scanned the clearing with the flashlight, but there was nothing there. No figures, no movement, just the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. "We're packing up and leaving," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no room for argument. We quickly gathered our belongings, not bothering to pack everything neatly. Our only priority was getting out of the forest as quickly as possible. As we hiked back to the car, the forest seemed unnervingly quiet, as though it was holding its breath. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, but we didn't encounter anyone, or anything, on our way out. When we finally reached the car, the relief was almost overwhelming. We loaded our gear into the trunk and drove away, leaving Urpo Forest behind. Neither of us spoke much during the drive home. The experience had left us shaken, and the memory of that night lingered like a dark cloud over our heads. Cody apologized for insisting we stay the night, but I couldn't bring myself to blame him. We had no way of knowing what or who was out there. Even after we left Urpo Forest behind, the events of that night weighed heavily on both of us. Cody, usually the more stoic of the two of us, was uncharacteristically quiet during the drive back. The faint hum of the car engine was the only sound, and I could tell he was replaying everything in his mind, just as I was. The memory of that humming, those footsteps, and the figure outside my tent. It all felt too surreal, like a scene pulled straight from a nightmare. When we finally reached Cody's place, we unloaded the car in silence. As we carried the camping gear into his garage, Cody broke the quiet. "We need to figure out what that was," he said, his voice firm but uneasy. "That wasn't just someone passing through. It was deliberate." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what answers we could hope to find. "Maybe it was just some weirdo messing with us," I suggested, though the words felt hollow as I said them. Deep down, I knew it was more than that. Over the next few days, Cody and I did some research about Urpo Forest. We scoured forums and local news sites, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. To my surprise, there were multiple accounts of strange occurrences in that area. Reports of campers hearing unexplained noises, seeing shadowy figures, and even finding their campsites disturbed while they slept. One story, in particular, stood out. A man had camped in the same area several years ago and claimed to have heard the same eerie humming we did. He wrote about how the sounds seemed to circle his campsite, growing louder and then fading away, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them was toying with him. He ended his post with a chilling warning. "If you hear the humming, leave immediately. Don't wait to find out what's behind it." Reading that sent a shiver down my spine. Cody and I exchanged a look, both of us thinking the same thing. We were lucky to have left when we did. But as unsettling as the stories were, they didn't provide any concrete answers. The humming remained a mystery, and the figure outside my tent was an image I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark silhouette, unmoving and silent, just watching. A week passed, and life began to return to normal, at least for me. Cody, however, seemed different. He started mentioning that he couldn't sleep well and kept having vivid nightmares about the forest. In one of them, he said he saw the figure standing at the edge of his bed, humming that same tune. "I wake up, and I swear I can still hear it," he admitted one night over beers. "It's like it followed me back." I tried to reassure him, saying it was probably just his mind playing tricks on him. But a part of me wondered if there was more to it. After all, I hadn't experienced the same nightmares or unease he described. Why was it affecting him so much more? Then, one night, Cody called me, his voice shaky and urgent. "Clark, I need you to come over," he said. "Something's wrong." I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my keys, I drove to his place, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Cody was sitting on his front porch, his bear spray clutched tightly in one hand. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the tree line at the edge of his property. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down beside him. Cody took a deep breath before answering. "I heard it again," he said. "The humming. It was coming from the woods behind the house." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just..." "Unsure," he interrupted. I went out there with a flashlight, thinking maybe it was an animal or something. But I didn't see anything. The sound just stopped as soon as I got close. The thought of that haunting melody following Cody back to his home sent a chill through me. "Did you see anyone? Anything?" He shook his head. "Nothing. But I feel like I'm being watched, even now." I glanced toward the dark tree line, half expecting to see a figure step out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Still, the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if we weren't truly alone. "Let's go inside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Cody nodded, and we went into his house, locking the door behind us. Inside, he told me more about the strange occurrences he'd noticed over the past week. Objects in his house being moved, faint knocks at his windows late at night, and that constant feeling of being watched. "Maybe it's just your nerves," I offered, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "That night in the forest really messed with us. It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you." Cody didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his jaw clenched. "What if it's not?" he finally said. "What if it's real?" We decided to stay up that night, keeping watch together. Cody brought out his camping gear, including his flashlight and bear spray, and we sat in the living room with the lights off, listening intently for any unusual sounds. The hours ticked by in tense silence, and just when I was starting to think nothing would happen, we heard it, a faint, melodic humming, drifting through the night. My blood ran cold. Cody looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "You hear it too, don't you?" he whispered. I nodded, my mouth dry. The sound was distant but unmistakable, carrying the same haunting quality as it had in the forest. It seemed to come from the backyard, just beyond the window. Cody grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. "We have to check," he said, his voice trembling. Every instinct in me screamed to stay inside, but I couldn't let Cody go out there alone. Together, we stepped into the backyard, the cold night air biting at our skin. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as we scanned the tree line, searching for the source of the sound. The humming grew louder as we approached the edge of the woods. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more unnerving than the sound itself. Cody shone the flashlight around, his hand shaking. "Do you see anything?" he whispered. Before I could answer, there was a rustle in the bushes nearby. We both froze, the flashlight beam fixed on the spot. Slowly, the leaves parted, and a figure emerged. A shadowy silhouette that sent a jolt of fear through me. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its face was obscured by the darkness. Cody raised the bear spray, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. The humming started again, low and haunting, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed with fear. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure melted back into the shadows, taking the sound with it. Cody and I stood there, too stunned to speak, until he finally lowered the bear spray. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. "Tonight." We didn't pack much, just the essentials. By the time we got back into the house and gathered our things, the first light of dawn was beginning to break. The drive back to my place was silent, neither of us daring to speak about what we'd seen. Whatever had followed us from Urpo Forest was still out there, and the thought of it still sends chills down my spine. For weeks after the incident at Cody's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cody and I barely talked about what had happened that night. It felt like neither of us wanted to acknowledge it. But the silence didn't make the memories fade. If anything, it made them worse. The humming echoed in my mind at random moments, and I started jumping at shadows, convinced I was being watched. Cody, however, seemed to take it even harder. He stopped reaching out as often and became increasingly reclusive. When I did manage to visit him, his house had changed. Curtains were always drawn, the locks on his doors reinforced, and he had installed motion sensor lights around his property. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. "What's going on, Cody?" I asked one evening after I'd finally convinced him to let me come over. "You're not yourself." He hesitated, avoiding my gaze. "It's nothing. Just stress from work," he said, but I knew it wasn't the truth. His eyes darted toward the window as he spoke, and I caught the faintest tremor in his hand as he held his coffee mug. "Cody," I said firmly, "is it about what happened in the forest? Or the humming?" At that, his face paled. He set down the mug and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I hear it," he admitted finally, "every night. It's faint, but it's there. And I see things, shadows, figures in the woods. I know it sounds crazy, but I feel like it's following me." A chill ran down my spine. "Have you seen it? The figure from that night?" He shook his head. "No, at least not clearly, but I know it's out there, watching." I didn't know how to respond. Cody had always been the rational one, the voice of reason. Hearing him talk like this unnerved me more than I cared to admit. Have you thought about leaving? Maybe staying somewhere else for a while? He gave a hollow laugh. And what? Drag this thing somewhere else? No, I need to face it. Face it, I repeated, incredulous. You're talking about something we don't even understand. How do you face something like that? I don't know, he admitted, but I can't keep living like this. That conversation stuck with me long after I left Cody's house. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. The logical part of me wanted to believe there was a rational explanation for everything that had happened. But the part of me that had stood in that forest, listening to that haunting melody, knew better. A few nights later, Cody called me again. His voice was frantic, his words tumbling over each other. Clark, it's back. The humming. It's louder this time. Where are you? I asked, already grabbing my keys. At the house, he said. It's in the yard. I can see it. My blood ran cold. Lock the doors. Don't go outside. I'm on my way. I drove to his house as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, Cody was waiting for me on the porch, his face pale and drawn. It's gone, he said before I could even ask. But I know it'll come back. We went inside, locking the door behind us. Cody showed me his security cameras, pointing out a few clips from earlier that evening. In the grainy footage, we saw movement near the edge of the woods, a shadowy figure pacing back and forth. At one point, it stopped and turned toward the camera, but its face was indistinguishable, hidden by the darkness. Then, without warning, it vanished. See, Cody said, his voice trembling, I'm not imagining it. I didn't know what to say. The footage was unsettling, to say the least. And while it didn't prove anything supernatural, it was enough to make me uneasy. What do you want to do? I asked. I want to go back, Cody said after a long pause. To Urpo Forest? I asked, stunned. Are you serious? He nodded. We need to figure out what this is. If it's following me, then maybe it started there. Maybe we can find a way to stop it. The idea of returning to that place filled me with dread. But as much as I wanted to refuse, I couldn't abandon Cody. If he was determined to face this, then I had to be there with him. All right, I said reluctantly, but we do it on our terms, in the daytime, and we come prepared. The following weekend, we packed up our gear and drove back to Urpo Forest. This time, we brought more than just camping supplies. Cody had bought trail cameras, motion detectors, and even a small handheld camcorder. We weren't just camping, we were investigating. As we hiked to the same clearing where we'd camped before, the memories of that night came flooding back. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less eerie. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, put me on edge. When we reached the clearing, we set up camp quickly. Cody placed the trail cameras at strategic points around the perimeter, ensuring they covered every angle. We set up the motion detectors near the tents, their blinking red lights a constant reminder of why we were there. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun began to set, the familiar unease returned. The shadows lengthened, and the forest grew quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife fading into silence. We sat by the campfire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. Do you think he'll come back? I asked, breaking the silence. Cody stared into the fire, his jaw tight. I don't know, but if it does, we'll be ready. As night fell, we sat in tense anticipation, our ears straining for any sound. The minutes stretched into hours, and the silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Just when I was beginning to think nothing would happen, it started. The humming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But as we listened, it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the camcorder, switching it on and pointing it toward the trees. Cody stood, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. When we reached the clearing, we set up camp quickly. Cody placed the trail cameras at strategic points around the perimeter, ensuring they covered every angle. We set up the motion detectors near the tents, their blinking red lights a constant reminder of why we were there. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun began to set, the familiar unease returned. The shadows lengthened, and the forest grew quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife fading into silence. We sat by the campfire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. "Do you think he'll come back?" I asked, breaking the silence. Cody stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "I don't know, but if it does, we'll be ready." As night fell, we sat in tense anticipation, our ears straining for any sound. The minutes stretched into hours, and the silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Just when I was beginning to think nothing would happen, it started. The humming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But as we listened, it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the camcorder, switching it on and pointing it toward the trees. Cody stood, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The figure stepped into the edge of the firelight, just far enough for us to make out its form. It was tall, unnaturally so, and impossibly thin. Its long arms hung at its sides, the hands limp but oddly angled, as if the bones beneath its skin were broken or misaligned. Its face was obscured, shrouded in darkness despite the flickering glow of the fire. Yet the most unsettling detail was its stillness. It didn't sway or shuffle like a living creature might. It simply stood there, perfectly motionless. Cody raised his flashlight and aimed it directly at the figure. The beam should have illuminated it fully, but somehow the figure remained veiled in shadow. "Who are you?" Cody demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, the humming grew louder, reverberating through the clearing, as though the air itself was vibrating. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a sensation, crawling over our skin and seeping into our bones. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, my grip tightening on the camcorder as I continued filming. "Do you see this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the oppressive hum. Cody nodded, his face pale and drawn. He reached for the can of bear spray at his hip, his hand trembling slightly. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm warning you." The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills racing down my spine. It took a single step forward, and though it was still several feet away, the sense of danger was immediate and overwhelming. Cody aimed the bear spray and pressed the trigger, releasing a powerful stream of chemical deterrent into the air. The spray should have created a visible cloud in the firelight, but instead, it seemed to dissipate before reaching the figure. The humming changed then, shifting into a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The fire flickered wildly, the flames shrinking as though they were being suffocated. "Run!" Cody shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the trail. I dropped the camcorder in my haste, the device landing with a dull thud in the dirt. There was no time to retrieve it. The figure began to move, its strides impossibly long as it followed us. We sprinted through the woods, the beam of Cody's flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin. The humming pursued us, growing louder and more discordant, until it was a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. Cody was ahead of me, his breathing ragged but steady. "Almost there," he shouted, glancing back to make sure I was still behind him. I risked a look over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The figure was closer than I'd realized, moving with an unnatural speed despite its slow, deliberate gait. Its limbs seemed to stretch and twist as it advanced, the darkness around it thickening like a living shadow. We broke through the tree line and into the small clearing where our car was parked. Cody fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. "Get in," he yelled, throwing open the driver's side door. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as Cody started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail ahead. But just as Cody shifted into drive, the figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still once more. Its head tilted to the side, and the humming ceased. For a moment, there was silence. Then it raised one of its impossibly long arms and pointed directly at us. "Go!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. Cody floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as we sped down the trail. The figure didn't follow, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that seemed to cling to us even as the distance grew. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the forest, the first light of dawn beginning to break over the horizon. When Cody finally pulled over, we sat in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. My hands were trembling, my heart still racing as I tried to process what we had just experienced. After several minutes, Cody broke the silence. "Did you get it on camera?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if the footage would be usable. I dropped the camcorder back there, I admitted, guilt creeping into my voice. Cody let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "Doesn't matter," he said quietly. "We're not going back." I didn't argue. Whatever was in Urpo Forest, it wasn't something we could understand or fight. And it wasn't worth risking our lives to try. The rest of the drive was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we neared the city, a realization struck me. The humming had stopped, but its memory lingered, an echo that refused to fade. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of it. The days following our return from Urpo Forest were some of the most unsettling of my life. Even back in the comfort of my own home, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, how could something from the forest follow us all the way to the city? But the lingering dread refused to dissipate, and I found myself double-checking my locks every night and leaving all the lights on. Cody and I spoke sparingly. Each conversation felt heavy, like neither of us wanted to fully confront what had happened. I wanted to believe that our experience was behind us, that leaving the forest had severed any connection to whatever we had encountered. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The first strange occurrence happened 3 days after we returned. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint sound coming from outside my bedroom window. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as I lay there listening, it grew clearer. It was humming, the same haunting melody from the forest. My blood turned cold. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. The sound seemed to drift through the air, faint but unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a leftover fragment of fear from our ordeal. But the longer I listened, the harder it became to dismiss. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and crept to the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. There was no one there. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, my heart pounding. The humming continued for a few more minutes before fading into silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called Cody. "I think it's happening again," I said as soon as he picked up. "The humming, I heard it last night." There was a long pause before he replied. "I've been hearing it too," he admitted, his voice low. "But it's not just the humming. Things are moving in my house. Doors that were closed are open when I wake up. Lights flicker even though I just replaced the bulbs. The knot of fear in my stomach tightened. Do you think it followed us?
I don't know, he said, but it's not stopping.
And I don't think it will. We spent the next hour brainstorming what to do. Cody suggested contacting a paranormal investigator, while I leaned towards seeking out local folklore experts to learn more about Urpo Forest. Neither of us were particularly superstitious, but after what we had experienced, we were willing to try anything. That evening, Cody texted me a link to an obscure blog about urban legends in Colorado. One post stood out. It described a phenomenon known as the Shadow Watcher, a malevolent entity said to haunt deep, secluded forests. According to the blog, the Shadow Watcher would attach itself to those who ventured too close, following them back to their homes and feeding on their fear. The descriptions matched our experience almost too perfectly. The unnatural movements, the oppressive presence, the haunting melody. But the blog offered no solutions, only a grim warning. Once it finds you, it never lets go. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as a wave of helplessness washed over me. I didn't want to believe it, but what other explanation was there? Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the rules of the natural world. That night, I did everything I could to ward off the growing sense of unease. I left lights on in every room, played music to drown out the silence, and even burned sage, something I had seen done in movies. But none of it made me feel any safer. Around midnight, the humming returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo through the entire house, vibrating in the walls and floor. I grabbed my phone and called Cody, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "It's here," I said as soon as he picked up. "Stay on the line," he replied, his voice steady despite the situation. "Do you see it?" "No," I said, my eyes darting around the room. "But it's close. I can feel it." "Don't go outside," he warned. "Whatever you do, don't open the door." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and then it stopped. The sudden silence was even more unsettling than the noise. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. "Cody," I whispered, "there's someone at the window." "Don't look," he said immediately. "Just stay where you are." But I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure on the other side, its shadow distorted and elongated. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. "Cody, it's here," I said, my voice barely audible. "I'm coming over," he said. "Just stay on the line." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence suffocating. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, like a slow, deliberate knock. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of my phone. It felt like an eternity before I heard the sound of Cody's car pulling up outside. The tapping stopped, and the shadow vanished. I ran to the door and let him in, relief washing over me at the sight of him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "It was at the window," I said. "I don't know what it wants, but it's not going away." Cody stayed with me that night, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of safety. But as we sat in the dimly lit living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whatever had attached itself to us wasn't finished yet. The morning after Cody stayed over, we both felt the weight of our sleepless night pressing down on us. The reality of our situation was undeniable now. This thing wasn't just some creepy memory from Urpo Forest. It was real, it had followed us, and it wasn't going to stop. We needed answers. Over coffee, we brainstormed. Cody suggested we do more research, but we'd already combed through blogs and forums with little to show for it. We needed something concrete, someone with experience, not just scattered accounts from strangers online. That's when Cody brought up the blog about the Shadow Watcher. It had been unsettlingly accurate, and its description of the entity's behavior matched our experiences too perfectly to ignore. "Didn't that blog have a contact at the bottom?" Cody asked. I pulled out my phone and opened the bookmarked page. Sure enough, there was an email address, email protected. It felt like a long shot, but desperation has a way of making even the smallest hope seem worth chasing. Without hesitation, I typed out an email detailing our experience. I kept it factual and concise, but I didn't hold back on the urgency. As I hit send, a mix of dread and relief washed over me. The ball was in their court now. We spent the rest of the day on edge, compulsively refreshing my email inbox. Hours dragged by with no reply. By the time the sun began to set, I was ready to give up. But just as I was about to close my laptop, a new email notification appeared. Subject: Shadow Watcher. You're dealing with the real thing. Meet me at the Pinewood Diner tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. AT. I read the email aloud to Cody, who frowned. That's vague. Who's AT? No idea, I admitted. But if they know something we don't, we have to hear them out. Cody was skeptical. What if it's a trap? We're putting a lot of trust in someone we know nothing about. I get that, I said, but what other choice do we have? If this person has faced the Shadow Watcher and survived, we need to know how. Cody reluctantly agreed, but he insisted I call him immediately after the meeting. If anything feels off, get out of there, he said. His concern was palpable, and for good reason. We weren't exactly in a position to take chances. The next day, I drove to the Pinewood Diner, my stomach in knots the entire way. The place was tucked on the outskirts of town, a relic of the past with its retro decor and faded neon sign. I parked in the gravel lot and scanned the parking area, noting only a handful of cars. This was either the start of answers or another layer of mystery. Inside, the diner was quiet. A waitress greeted me with a polite smile, but my eyes immediately locked onto a man sitting in the far corner booth. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, his face lined with a mix of age and worry. His piercing eyes met mine, and he nodded, gesturing for me to join him. "Your clock," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. His voice was low, with a rough edge that suggested a life lived hard. "I'm Matt. You can call me Alex. Thanks for meeting me," I said cautiously. "How do you know about the Shadow Watcher?" He leaned back in his seat, his gaze never leaving mine. "Because I've encountered it. A long time ago. I know what it is and what it wants." His certainty sent a shiver through me. "What does it want?" "Fear," Alex said bluntly. "It's a parasite. It latches onto people and feeds off their terror. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets. It's not random either. It chooses its victims carefully. Once it finds you, it doesn't let go. Not unless you make it." The weight of his words sank in. So how do we stop it? Alex's expression darkened. "You have to confront it. Go back to where it all started and face it head on. But you can't show fear, not even a hint of it. That's the only way to break the connection." The idea of returning to Urpo Forest made my stomach churn. "What if we fail?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex didn't hesitate. "Then it'll keep coming for you. It'll weigh you down until there's nothing left." The finality of his statement left me reeling. "Have you ever seen anyone fail?" "Yes," he said quietly, his eyes distant. "A friend of mine. He thought he could ignore it, that it would eventually leave him alone. But he was wrong. It consumed him." The implication was clear, and it was terrifying. "So we just go back and confront it. That's it." Alex nodded. "That's it. But don't go unprepared." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pouch, sliding it across the table. "Burn this when you're out there. It's a mixture of herbs and salts. It won't stop the shadow watcher, but it'll give you a little breathing room. Use it wisely. I picked up the pouch, feeling its coarse texture under my fingers. Thank you, I said. I mean it. Alex gave a small nod. Just be careful. And remember, no fear. That's what it's counting on. As I left the diner, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. Cody and I had a plan now, but it was a plan filled with uncertainty and danger. Still, we had no choice. If we didn't confront this thing, it would never stop. That night, I met with Cody to prepare. We packed everything we'd need: flashlights, a camcorder, and Alex's pouch of herbs. Neither of us spoke much, the gravity of our task hanging heavily between us. By the time we finished packing, the plan was set. Tomorrow, we'd return to Urpo Forest. This time, there would be no running. It was time to face the Shadow Watcher once and for all. The drive to Urpo Forest was steeped in an uneasy silence. Cody and I didn't need to speak to feel the shared weight of what lay ahead. Every mile that brought us closer to the forest felt like it was pulling us back into a nightmare we weren't sure we'd escape from a second time. Cody gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while I stared out the window, the trees growing denser as we neared our destination. "Do you think this is going to work?" Cody asked finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "I don't know," I admitted. "But what's the alternative? Living like this forever?" The words felt heavier than I intended, but they were the truth. Cody nodded, his jaw tightening. "No, we end it here." We arrived at the forest just after noon, the sunlight filtering through the towering trees. The daylight made the place feel less oppressive, but the memory of what we had experienced here lingered like a dark stain. We parked near the same picnic area where we had started our first trip, the spot now carrying a sense of foreboding rather than adventure. After unloading our gear, we began the hike back to the clearing. Cody carried the camcorder, its red light blinking faintly as it recorded our every step. I had Alex's pouch of herbs clutched tightly in my hand, the small grains and dried leaves pressing against my palm. Neither of us spoke much as we walked, our focus split between the trail ahead and the creeping anxiety building in our chests. The clearing was exactly as we had left it, untouched by time or human interference. The fire pit we had built was still there, its stones slightly scattered but intact. The remnants of our last night here hung in the air, invisible but suffocating. "We set everything up," Cody said, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. "The cameras, the motion sensors, the herbs, everything. We don't leave until this is over." I nodded, setting down my bag and pulling out the pouch Alex had given me. Following his instructions, I spread the mixture around the perimeter of the clearing, creating a protective circle. The pungent smell of the herbs filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would work. As the sun began to set, we sat near the fire pit, the glow of our small fire casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The cameras were set up at strategic points, their lenses pointed toward the trees, and the motion sensors blinked steadily, waiting to detect even the slightest movement. Cody broke the silence. "If this thing shows up, we don't back down. No running." "Agreed," I said, though my stomach churned at the thought. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects absent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it started. The humming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. But it grew louder with each passing second, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. The sound was disjointed and haunting, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Cody turned on the camcorder, aiming it toward the direction of the sound. "It's here," he said, his voice low. I gripped the pouch of herbs tightly, my hands trembling as I stood. The humming grew louder still, and from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow slit between the trees, its shape shifting and elongating unnaturally. "It's coming," I whispered, my breath hitching. The figure emerged from the tree line, stepping into the clearing with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. It was just as I remembered, tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in darkness. Its face was still obscured, a void where its features should have been. And yet, I felt its gaze, heavy and piercing, as if it could see straight into my soul. Cody stood his ground, his hand hovering near the bear spray. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The figure tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow, and the humming shifted. It was deeper now, almost guttural, resonating in a way that made my chest vibrate. The fire dimmed, the flames shrinking as though they were being drained of life. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "We're not afraid," I repeated, more to myself than to the entity. I reached into the pouch and grabbed a handful of the herbs, tossing them into the fire. The flames rose to life, surging higher and brighter than before, and the figure flinched, retreating slightly. "It's working," Cody said, his voice laced with both hope and fear. The figure straightened, its retreating step replaced by a sudden advance. It moved faster now, closing the distance between us with unnerving speed. The humming grew deafening, a chaotic cacophony that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath our feet. "Stand your ground," Cody yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. He raised the camcorder, pointing it directly at the figure. No fear. I clenched my fists, fighting the primal urge to run. The figure stopped abruptly, just feet away from the edge of the firelight. It loomed there, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the clearing, and for a moment, everything went silent. The humming ceased, the forest still as death. And then it spoke. "You cannot escape me," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your fear feeds me." I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking but defiant. "We're not afraid of you. You don't control us." The figure remained still, as if studying us. The firelight flickered, casting strange, shifting patterns across its form. Then, without warning, it began to dissolve. Its body disintegrated into shadowy tendrils, which swirled into the air before vanishing completely. The oppressive weight in the clearing lifted, and the fire burned brighter than ever. Cody and I stood there, stunned and trembling, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The forest was quiet again, but this time it felt peaceful, as though whatever had haunted it was truly gone. "It's over," Cody said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." I nodded, though my legs felt like jelly beneath me. "Let's get out of here." We packed up our gear in silence, neither of us wanting to linger any longer than necessary. As we hiked back to the car, the forest seemed almost welcoming, the sunlight filtering through the trees like a warm embrace. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. Whatever the Shadow Watcher had been, it was gone now. We had faced it, and we had won. But deep down, I couldn't shake one lingering thought. What if it wasn't gone for good? The ride back from Urpo Forest was quiet, but not in the same oppressive way it had been before. Cody and I were exhausted, emotionally and physically, but there was a shared sense of relief between us, a weight that had lifted. For the first time since that night in the forest, I felt like we could breathe again. "I still can't believe it worked," Cody said, his voice breaking the silence. "Neither can I admitted. But it did. It's gone." Cody glanced at me, his expression hesitant. "Do you really think it's gone? For good?" I hesitated before answering. "I think we broke its hold on us. But I don't know if something like that ever really disappears." Cody didn't respond right away, but I could see the gears turning in his head. "I guess it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're free now." We drove the rest of the way in silence, the weight of everything we'd been through still settling over us. When we finally pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house brought a wave of comfort. Cody helped me unload my gear before heading home himself, promising to call me the next day. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The usual paranoia, the constant feeling of being watched, was gone. The humming didn't return, and the silence in my house felt peaceful rather than ominous. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that we had truly put the shadow watcher behind us. The following morning, Cody and I checked in with each other. He sounded lighter, more like his old self, and he even joked about how we should celebrate. Maybe a camping trip, he said with a laugh. Not in this lifetime, I replied, but I couldn't help but laugh along with him. It felt good to joke about it, to finally start moving past the fear. A week went by, then two. Life started to feel normal again. I returned to work, reconnected with friends, and tried to leave the events of Urpo Forest behind me. Cody did the same, throwing himself into his hobbies and even talking about dating again. It was as if we were both determined to reclaim the parts of our lives that the Shadow Watcher had stolen from us. But the memory of that night never fully left me. Every now and then, I'd catch myself listening for the faintest hint of humming or glancing over my shoulder when I was alone. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a residual unease, a reminder of how close we had come to losing ourselves. One evening, about a month after our final confrontation in the forest, I received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Curious but cautious, I opened it. Inside was a single item, a flash drive. I plugged it into my laptop, half expecting it to be blank or corrupted. Instead, a single video file appeared on the screen, labeled with a string of random numbers. My stomach twisted as I clicked on it, the memory of the camcorder we used in Urpo Forest flashing through my mind. The video began with static, the distorted image slowly resolving into a scene I recognized immediately. The clearing in Urpo Forest. It was footage from the camcorder we had set up that night, the red light blinking faintly in the corner of the screen. I leaned closer, my heart pounding as I watched the scene unfold. At first, it was just Cody and me, sitting by the fire, our voices faint but clear. Then the humming began, and the figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Watching it again, I felt the same chill I had that night, the same overwhelming sense of dread. But then something changed. As the figure stepped closer to the fire, the video distorted, the image warping and glitching. For a moment, the screen went completely black. When the video returned, the figure was gone, and the fire burned brightly, just as it had when we drove the entity away. But then the camera shifted. The lens, which had been focused on the clearing, slowly panned toward the trees. My breath caught in my throat as the camera zoomed in on the shadows between the trunks. At first, there was nothing, just darkness. But then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the distance. The video ended abruptly, the screen cutting to static. I stared at my laptop, my mind racing. How had the camcorder footage ended up here? And more importantly, what did it mean? I called Cody immediately, my hands shaking as I explained what I'd just seen. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Do you think it's still out there?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it doesn't feel like this is over." Cody sighed heavily. "We've already faced it once. If it comes back, we'll deal with it." I wanted to believe him, but the image of those glowing eyes lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that some things can't be easily defeated or forgotten. In the days following the arrival of the flash drive, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The glowing eyes in the video felt like a message, a warning that we hadn't truly escaped the Shadow Watcher. Cody and I kept in close contact, constantly checking in with each other for any signs that it was back. But for a while, everything seemed quiet, too quiet. It wasn't until a week later that things took a turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint noise, a low, guttural humming that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep in the house. My stomach dropped as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was the same sound we had heard in Urpo Forest, the same melody that had haunted us ever since. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me. It was a text from Cody. "Do you hear it?" I didn't respond right away. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my bed and slowly crept toward the bedroom door. The humming grew louder as I stepped into the hallway, the shadows around me seeming to stretch and shift in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. As I reached the living room, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I swept the flashlight around the room, half expecting to see the figure standing there watching me. But the room was empty. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Cody. "It's outside." I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the front yard. At first, everything looked normal. The driveway, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, its tall, shadowy form barely illuminated by the streetlights. Its face, or lack thereof, was turned toward my house, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. My hands trembled as I let the curtain fall back into place. I called Cody, my voice shaking as I told him what I'd seen. "It's back," I said. "It's here." "Same here," Cody replied, his tone grim. "It's outside my place too." "What do we do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "We face it," Cody said firmly, "just like before." I wanted to protest, to tell him it was different this time, but I knew he was right. If we ran, it would only grow stronger. If we gave in to our fear, we'd be feeding it exactly what it wanted. "I'm coming to you," Cody said. "Stay inside. Don't let it in." The next hour felt like an eternity as I waited for Cody to arrive. The figure remained outside, motionless but menacing, its presence a constant reminder of the danger we were in. When Cody finally pulled into the driveway, the headlights of his car briefly illuminated the figure. But instead of disappearing into the shadows, it seemed to grow darker, more defined. Cody burst through the door, his face pale but determined. "We need to draw it out," he said, setting down the gear he had brought with him. Candles, salt, and the remaining herbs from Alex's pouch. "If it's here for us, we make it come to us on our terms." We worked quickly, creating a protective circle in the living room and lighting the candles. The air grew heavy as we prepared, the weight of the Shadow Watcher's presence pressing down on us. The humming resumed, louder and more insistent, vibrating through the walls and floor. "Are you ready?" Cody asked, his eyes locked on mine. I nodded, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "Let's do this." We stepped into the circle, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows across the room. Cody began reciting the words Alex had written on a slip of paper he had tucked into his pocket. They were simple, a declaration of strength and defiance. "We are not afraid. You have no power over us." The humming grew louder, almost deafening, as the figure appeared in the doorway. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. The candles flickered violently, but they didn't go out. "You don't belong here," Cody said, his voice strong despite the fear I knew he felt. "Leave, or face the consequences." The figure paused, tilting its head as if considering his words. Then it took another step forward, crossing the threshold of the house. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. "We are not afraid," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You have no power here." The figure stopped, its body flickering like a dying flame. The humming faltered, breaking into disjointed notes before fading into silence. For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the crackling of the candles. Then, with a final guttural sound, the figure dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm again. Cody and I stood there frozen, as the realization sank in. "It's gone," Cody said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For good this time." I wanted to believe him, but the events of the past weeks had taught me to be cautious. Still, the house felt different. Lighter, safer. Whatever hold the Shadow Watcher had on us seemed to be broken. As we cleaned up the living room, Cody turned to me and smiled faintly. "No more camping trips," he said. "Agreed," I replied, a small laugh escaping despite the tension. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept without fear. Whether the Shadow Watcher was truly gone or simply waiting for another opportunity, I didn't know. But for now, I was free, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Tales of the Abyss for more spine-tingling stories. What do you think was the Shadow Watcher's true purpose? Could it still be out there? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theories. And if you've ever experienced something eerie or unexplainable, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments or email it to your email or preferred contact. And it might just be featured in an upcoming video. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the abyss is closer than you think.